I can just use that and provide a commentary. Whilst he's getting back on, I just want to say that this particular air quality conference isn't just any air quality conference. I mean, people think, gosh, you know, universities and NGOs, you must be having air quality discussions all the time. But do note that this one is co-organized by the Environment Bureau. And we do not co-organize many such events. The reason we're co-organizing this one is because this one is the #1 regional air quality event in China. In China, it's a Chinese conference, right? The mainland Chinese conference, and it's the short form is for RAQM, right? This is the 4th regional air management conference. So there were 3 more. The other 3 were all in Guangdong, and the 5th one will be in Guangdong, right? So we were actually very privileged to be given the opportunity to host this conference in Hong Kong. And it's an indication of our ever-growing, closer cooperation with the mainland that we were able to do it here. So that's why the Environment Bureau, we were a co-organizer, we worked very hard along with HKUST. Indeed, the science advisor is Professor Hao Jiming, who's not here with us today, but a good friend of Zhu Tong's and a good friend of ours. He's with Tsinghua University, and he is the man that the top leaders, and I'm talking about the top leaders, he briefs them. So, you know, this is why this conference is so important to us. May I have the... You know about this. Policy formulation, all of you, because you're here today because you're interested in this subject. And I'm willing to bet that most of you have read our Clean Air Plan that was published in March last year. Alexis and I come from the same school, right? So I agree with him. Now, basically what we want to say today is, okay, everybody always used to complain the government is never here. Okay, then he is saying Environment Bureau is here, but how come we haven't got the transport people here? How come we haven't got the planning people here? How come we haven't got economic development people here? They're not here because you didn't invite them. That's number one. Number two is, and for all of you, for those of you who are in the business sector, for those of you who are in NGOs, if you keep using the word environment, if you keep having events that the highlight is the environment, my colleagues will think, get Christine there, get KS there. Now, if they're having a discussion about economic development, they forget to invite me. But look at what all of you, particularly those of you who are leading members of chambers of commerce, right? How many years have you been complaining about air quality being a real problem for you? You know, that you cannot hire international talent, that your staff is complaining and so on, right? But you don't invite me when you have an economic conference. Why don't you do it next time and say air pollution, you know, environmental degradation? Is this an economic issue? But invite Greg So, the minister responsible for economic and commercial development. Put us both there. Tell us that that's what you care about. You never do it. Please do it tomorrow. Okay? Okay? And don't call everything the environment. Same with you at the university. Okay. AQO review. Yes, AQO review. We passed a law, so we have tighter AQOs. In the law itself, it mandates the government must do a review. All right, so the laws, so we now have the new AQO. That means within 5 years. It doesn't mean we can't do it before, right? But at least once every 5 years, we're mandated to do a review. Alexis is absolutely right. We need to put a review process in place. This is what we now have to do, because we're not going to start the review in the 5th year. But what I would like you to do is to keep now pressing us. NGOs, you've never said anything to us on the review process. The legislature, they haven't pressed us enough. it's all right, it's your mission for 2014. Press us to have this. Now, one of the things that we have promised the legislature is that we would involve the academic sector, the experts in Hong Kong, in all kinds of air quality issues. So we would obviously have to involve the local experts when we put in place these review processes. And we don't have to start anew. There are other places in the world, and we saw the very complicated map about how you do review. So of course, what we're going to start off doing is looking at how other jurisdictions do their reviews. We can't have a review process that looks nothing like theirs. We can't have a review process that is not rigorous. Right? But this is the next step that we will go on. Now, Alexis Lau talked about how do we, in Hong Kong, institutionalize a kind of science policy advisory work. Now, this is something new, but I'm going to tell you something that happened that Alexis was a part of, and that is the start of that process. In October 2012, we invited in a closed-door meeting a whole range of experts in Hong Kong. Alexis was there, many members of the health sector were there. So the science, the health, we had a number of economists. We all sat together, and my entire top-level team, from the permanent secretary to Secretary Wong to EPD officials, they were all there. This had never happened before. Now, it was a closed-door discussion, but there was a lot of preparation before that discussion. And I asked Alexis Lau to actually be the coordinator. What we wanted was for the science and health sector to tell the top people in the Environment Bureau and in EPD, just give us the beef. Tell us what you think. And basically, they helped the government to chart the course. They said, right, if I'm summarizing, the first thing is traffic, roadside pollution, really bad. Shipping, a major risk. Right? So these are the things, if we're concerned about health, if we're concerned about exposure, that we've got to focus on. There was no disagreement from people from EPD, so that's the direction. That's the direction we're going on. Now, that discussion was in October 2013. We should have another one of those discussions. And for some of you who remember, we also had a number of public engagement process. We had the discussion with the experts, then we had the discussion with the community. So if I were to just go for, okay, so this was the review process. We're gonna have to do something like this. Now, let me just repeat what is our policy today. And if you can help me, just remember these few words so that you can repeat it to yourself and you can go and tell other people, right? We're responsible for our own mess, right? So we must work hard to clean up local pollution. Secondly, is our policies must be evidence-based. Thirdly, is we must involve the community and stakeholders. Next, we must work regionally, right? Regionally, meaning with Guangdong. And lastly, because of the very severe air pollution problem in the whole of China, we must be part of the national effort to clean up. Right? You can repeat that, right? That makes sense. Okay. That is our policy. Professor Zhu Tong has reminded us that there is something called right? The 10 national plans. We were privileged through our relationship with the Ministry of the Environment, through the scientific community in China. We knew this was coming. In fact, we had the insider view that what the 10 plans were going to be. And one thing that is very, very encouraging is the PRD. The national government knows that one of the things that is important is pollution moves around, and we can really only truly or succeed if we could collaborate regionally to see what we can do. So they have the Beijing-Tianjin area, they have the Shanghai, the Yangtze River Delta area, and the PRD area. Well, when we saw this, we thought, right, PRD, Hong Kong, Macau, we are there. Question, how are we going to deal with this? One country, two systems. We're not bound by the 15% reduction. However, we shouldn't ignore it. Question for us is, okay, this is now a new mission. You all know that in 2012, we had an agreement with Guangdong for emissions reduction. However, the national government has now asked the Guangdong government to have reductions by 2017. So, things are going to shift, things are going to speed up a little bit. Of course, we're very interested in how Hong Kong can be a part of the regional and national effort for emissions reduction. Okay, this is part of the national plan. The reason we must collaborate is to do co-prevention. So what does that mean? How can we prevent and then co-control? Now, maybe the scientists later on, you can tell people what co-prevention means. How are we going to do this under one country, two systems? How do we share information? How do we look at what kind of deepening collaboration that we can have? Now, we must not forget that in Hong Kong, we have 7 million people. There's 55 million people in the PRD. There's 100 million people in Guangdong. And we must not forget that a large part of Hong Kong people's investments, both in export production, in logistics, in infrastructure, is in the PRD. So this is one economic area for all of us. We are close. Well, actually, Hong Kong meets the PM 2.5 national standards at 35. Where do we go next? So in order for us to make much greater advance, we do have to collaborate with Guangdong. Regional forecast, yes, we are going to do that. We are talking to Guangdong. How to put these things in place, that's what we're going to do next. Okay, we are the leading region. Hong Kong and Guangdong have the opportunity to be the first region to achieve the national target. So this is where our ambition must lie. Air quality research and science. I think today it is so important, and it's Alexis Lau's vision that we have this particular session. I think none of us are going to be all air scientists, and I'm not an air science. I'm not an air science expert, but as a policymaker, I need to understand enough to be able to think through what it is that we have to do. So I think it is important for us, through better communication with all of you, to be able to summarize what it is that we have to do. What are the technology tools that we're using? How we can use technology, how we can look at health and combine it together in a much more multidisciplinary way of looking at solutions. You want to know how in our region, what are the reduction measures that we have to take to do so. So I'll just end by saying that in Hong Kong, what does cleaning up local pollution means? If we look at exposure, there are two things we have to do. One, a third thing we've done already. So let's talk about what we've done and then look at what we're doing now. Our coal plants, we have put technology on it. We have the sulfur reduction, we have the NOx reduction. So the coal plants in Hong Kong are about as clean as they can get. Now, are we measuring everything, and do we know whether they're working and so on? Well, it's good because we have the direct feed into the chimney. So the EPD, they do know what's coming out of the chimneys of our coal plants, so that's a good thing. All right, that's about as much as we can do. And already, our policy is to build no more coal plants here, and secondly, we are going to use more and more gas. The second thing about cars and vehicles is we have severe street cannon effects in the middle of our cities. So that's why we've spent nearly $12 billion of your money to go and take out 82,000 vehicles, diesel commercial vehicles, right? and I think it was John Watson who talked about the catalytic converter change in Hong Kong. I just want to say that as far as air science is concerned, the level of depth of the measurements that we have now done is very comprehensive. We know everything about what's coming out of the exhaust of the PLG taxis and the public light buses. That's why, again, we're using your money to, let's not argue with the owners. We're just giving them a new catalytic converter. We're paying for the catalytic converter and, you know, the replacement. And we're doing now 20,000 vehicles in Hong Kong in 6 months. That this is the biggest program of its kind. It's the biggest program for the 82,000 diesel commercial vehicles. Actually, we also have a third program to upgrade the, to change, again, the NOx devices in the franchise buses. So that's what we call end-of-pipe solution. They're very powerful, they can work. What John Watson wants us to do is keep measuring, so that you know once you've done this, right, that it's actually working. Yes, we're going to do that. All right, the other problem that we have are the ships. Hong Kong is a major port, and you know legislation is being gazetted today for local marine, for local vessels to use a much cleaner fuel. That will be passed in LegCo within 8 weeks because it's what we call subsidiary legislation. So by the 1st of April, local vessels will be mandated to use a much cleaner fuel. We're going to be putting legislation to the legislature in the next couple of months for the big vessels, the ocean-going vessels, to also switch fuels by 2015, and we've worked very hard with the ship owners and the ship liners to get that done. Something we're very proud of because we're the only jurisdiction outside North America and the EU to do so. We're the first to do so. We've gone to the Ministry of Transportation in China. The minister and the vice minister have been to Hong Kong, where again we presented to them the reason why we're doing fuel switching at birth. We have worked with Shenzhen. Shenzhen has certain ideas that they'd like to roll out. We need to work with Guangdong. So that's the kind of policy collaboration as well. We've also taken our research on shipping emissions to Shanghai, to the port of Shanghai. They are very interested to see what can be done. Our dream is, of course, in the short term, for the Pearl River Delta waters, that means all the ports in the PRD, to do fuel switching at birth. But to be honest, our vision is for the whole of the Chinese coast to do so. So we're working with our colleagues and counterparts on the mainland for this to be done. It will take a few years. This is a very big major move. And since Arthur Bowring of the Shipowners Association is here, he can tell you that once we pass the legislation in Hong Kong, the shipping sector will have to spend billions forever in doing this. You're quite right to ask, well then what's next? What's next? So there are some people in the audience who I know what work they're doing. There are some exciting things that is possible in Hong Kong, but let me stop now.
Thank you so much, Christine. I'd like to now open the floor for questions. And please tell us your name and your affiliation and try to keep your question or comment short. Thank you. David.
Good morning. David Bennett from the Natural Resources Defense Council in Los Angeles. Earlier, one of the speakers was talking about the State Council saying, for example, okay, in this area we're going to cut emissions by 15% and the like. My question is one of implementation. When that happens at the State Council level, whose job is it actually to get that done? And does the State Council give any guidance in terms of, well, you need to look at chip emissions, you need to look at heavy-duty trucks or the like?
Well, I think it's at the provincial levels they had to implement their objectives or plans. So each province or the municipals like Beijing, they have this implementation plan to do that. And from the Ministry of Environmental Protection, they have this kind of interactions at the province levels to make a recommendation. And this is a constant exchange of which industry sector or sectors will be the major target for which kind of purpose. So there actually, many provinces, they have a lot of projects that going on, try to figure out what's a major source for the PM in the different provinces, different cities. And so I think combining with this research would be get a better picture to figure out the progress in this field. I think it's still also a big challenge because now in the past we don't have enough data accumulation regarding emission inventory of different industry sectors. It has not been there as a routine operation. So I think this is what I make remarks that many policy or planning may lack of comprehensive scientific evidence for that. So this is what we should do, and it's happening now.
So you would have you would have a collaborative process to work out the inventories, and then a collaborative process to figure out which sectors do we need to target. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's actually my colleagues are extremely busy in the last years. There are so many provinces and there are so many projects going on. There's so many requests for proposals or to do the research with them, studying for the establish the emission inventory, to build up the monitoring network, and also to do the modeling to evaluate how the control measures will be effective. So this is a lot of projects going on in the different provinces, and highly demanded my colleagues. So we have been extremely busy working on that.
Thomas Gillar, Environmental Committee of Discovery Bay. I have a question regarding the air transport, which has been, I think Professor Lau just mentioned with one word, the airport. But I would like to talk about the air traffic. We have about over 300,000 air movements a year in Hong Kong. The Pearl River Delta has about 1 million aircraft movements a year. So what about the measurements of the air pollution from the aircraft? And also the question that we will have probably another runway in Hong Kong, and we plan to increase the air traffic further. And someone from the government even said we may have to plan for a fourth runway for 2030. So all this will, of course, add tremendously to air pollution. Thank you.
Well, I certainly understand the importance of air emission, particularly the NOx emission. But I mentioned is because the problem is big, and in terms of relative comparison, a lot of that emission is in higher area. Just like we have a lot of emission from a power plant, but then it was went out at a higher level. So in comparison with like the road traffic as well as the ships, which are emitted at much lower level, we think that in terms of the first targets must be going after those. I'm not saying that we should not look at or we should not reduce those emissions. I think that's also very important, and many other places where after they have taken care of a lot of the rest, air emission is a high priority. So from the government's point of view, I think they also should be looking at it, and I think in the new EIA requirement for the new runway, that's definitely need to be looked at. So I don't think we are thinking about omitting or understating the importance.
Well, I think if we look at Hong Kong, I cannot answer for the airport authority, but they have the ambition to be the greenest airport in the world. So I think they have an interesting plan, which you're no doubt familiar with. Secondly is we can look at the same problem with cars. the increase in the number of vehicles in Hong Kong is continuing to rise. Mostly, of course, private vehicles. If we are looking at the number of ships, even though the percentage of shipping container vessels has dropped in Hong Kong, the actual tonnage has gone up. And if we look at this whole area here, we have 3 of the top 10 container ports in the world. Hong Kong and Shenzhen are really sister ports. They're right next to each other. And if we're talking in emission terms, well, we affect each other. If we're talking about vehicles, there are a very large number of cross-boundary vehicles. This is only going to grow with the bridge and so on. So what I'm saying is, unfortunately, when we're looking at mobile sources, this is one of the most busy areas in the world. Now that is, of course, leads to the next question. If you are going to be so busy, we do need to focus on a much more massive cleanup process. If we again, going back to vehicles as a way of reflecting on air travel, because we have also a particular type of morphology in our city. I'm just talking about running down right from here, right? If you're going from Sheung right to the end of North Point, we have narrow streets, lots of people, lots of cars, which is why that's our number one priority. Our number one priority is that every moment of every day, there are hundreds of thousands of people suffering the highest exposure from vehicles. That's why we're focusing on that. Air travel, yes, Hong Kong wants to be an air hub. Yes, my colleagues have talked about the 3rd runway and maybe even a 4th runway. Let's leave the 4th runway out of this for now. It is eminent that Hong Kong will have to take a view on the 3rd runway. I believe the EIA's being done by the Airport Authority. I believe that's going to be available in the not too distant future. In light of the very high public interest in that, I believe the NGO community is going to be all over that EIA. Are there going to be mitigation measures? Are they going to be adequate? I think that's the discussion for the next period.
Thank you, Christine. Okay.
My name is Mary, a psychologist. I'm quite worried when Christine talked about the increasing motor vehicles in the look ahead. So I wonder if the government has ever started a review on the feasibility of building cycling track along the urban district, and also using policy to reduce private car vehicles into this busy district, and also encourage walking, pedestrian. And I think really cycling is the best solution to me, and and there are a lot of purposes achieved, like health and community, and really, I think government should have a serious look into this possibility.
This is where you need my colleagues from the Transport Department and THB to be there. If you have a conference that doesn't talk about air quality but highlights transport, you're going to have a better chance to discuss this issue. But make sure you invite us there. Right, so this is what I'm saying. And I think, in all your institutions, whether you're working in the business sector or whether you're working in the NGO sector, working across discipline is always difficult. It's difficult in your organization, it's difficult in government. How we get people to come together and talk about these things is important. To also say that cycling is the solution to our transport problem will turn people off, because it is not the right answer. It's really about how we use planning, use transport management techniques to improve or reduce exposure of people to vehicular emissions. Now that's what I would say in terms of the environment. Somebody else would say, well actually, if you open up pedestrian areas, what you can do is also revitalize business in that area. What I'm saying is, there are different messages in how you articulate an outcome you all want to see, but it's a multidisciplinary outcome. Dr. Ji Ning, sitting in that corner there from CityU, you might want to go and talk to him. He's done a magic piece of research that shows if you are willing to reorganize traffic, so manage traffic in a different way, how we can reduce exposure in the heart of Sheungwan, Central and Sheungwan. That is the kind of research that has the gems of moving policymakers. Telling policymakers, frankly, that cycling is the answer is not realistic. So I think my plea to you is think about how you frame what you say. Don't always just make it a single thing, right? I support cycling, so cycling is the answer. Put it in a broader picture, because we all know cycling is good, pedestrian is good, but how do we put it in a way where policymakers are going to be interested?
Thank you. Now, since Christine talked about urban morphology in Hong Kong and this question about cycling and walking, I'd like to bring back the discussion to the panelists. Professor Zhu Tong, in Beijing, of course, you have a huge problem there. And have you or have government even thought about coming from the direction of transport management, encouraging more cyclists, because we all know Beijing or most of the Chinese cities in the past, there are a lot of bicycles around, and also walking. I noticed a lot of bike sharing schemes now in China. Can you say a few things about that? And maybe after that, I can ask Bob to comment about with this street canyons and compactness in a city like Hong Kong. What about the connection between that and health effect, and what should we do? Should we encourage people to walk more because supposedly it should be healthy for the people, but then because of the filthy air, is it actually safe to do that? Professor Chu, please.
Yeah, I think the cycling in Beijing has been a good memory. Many people visit Beijing. 17th, 18th. Now, bicycles are driven away by cars, and so they tend to drive while cycling along the pedestrian lane. So there are cars parking on the cycling lane, so paths has been taken. So this became less attractive for people to do cycling in Beijing. When I was a student there, I have enjoyed very much. Now, if you cycle around the streets, you have the risk to be hit by cars, but more importantly, you breathe in the exhaust from cars. So, in that sense, it's not a healthy activity, cycling, more like convenience if you cannot afford to drive a car, if your license is not allowed to drive because of based on the license number. But I think now it's time for Beijing to look at cycles as a big issue. In the past 10 years, Beijing has done a lot of work to do this public transportation system for public transit. Now, building subway, now they have more than 400 kilometers of subway. So that's a big progress in a sense like this. And Beijing has also, I think, the cheapest ticket for taking the subway. It costs only 2 yuan for all 400 kilometers if you want to ride on that. So that means it has done a lot of work, but it cannot take so many people traveling in the same single days. You see a lot of long lines in the subway station and the lines outside the station in the early rush hour. So still a big pressure on that one. And in that sense, switching to more like cycling is, I think, became a priority. In that sense, it's a lot of lessons we can learn to the European countries that they have strong a lot of policy put a priority for people cycling, and also it's discrimination against the driving the cars. So this is, I think, it's time for Beijing to look at issues, but I think it's going to be a big issue because came to the old city planning, infrastructure, and also discovering people driving the cars. So.
Thank you, Bob.
Sure, that was a very comprehensive answer, but I could add to it a little bit. The World Bank is starting to do what I think is very useful, and Christine, a little bit along the lines of where you're talking about more integrated analyses of vehicles, for instance, and not looking at vehicles and air pollution, but looking at vehicles and road traffic and air pollution, and looking at the overall impact of the vehicle, which I think is a much more important way to approach this problem. I think certainly in very, very high pollution days, you don't want to be out cycling and you need to use common sense. On the other hand, cycling and cardiovascular activity and walkability, including and encouraging walkable cities, is a way to improve people's overall health, number one. And number two, to the extent that you're fostering those kinds of values, people will demand cleaner air. And I have a lot of problem with the avoidance behaviors as a strategy. It may be an interim strategy for high pollution days, but we really need to get out of a situation where we go indoors and we make our indoor environment really clean because the outdoor environment is too dirty, or we don't have bicycle pathways out there because the roadside exposures are too high because the vehicles are polluting too much. You know, that we're in a transition period hopefully now where vehicles are getting very clean, and when we move the legacy fleet through, that those things will gradually improve. And I think we need to keep focusing on improving those types of things so that we get to a place where we do walk and we do cycle and we create more livable cities, since people expect that.
Yeah, I just want to add a little here. I remember Civic Exchange organized a conference on sustainable transport, I think one of the series. And I remember talking to Reinhard, which is from Europe, about their experience. The take-home message I got is in the 60s, late 60s and early 70s, they already recognized the problem of traffic, and they have a vision. They try very hard at that time to try to get a lot of the vision implemented immediately, but the backlash was very strong, and it doesn't work. But they have long-term vision, and they slowly move first from at that time, now a lot of people in Europe do cycling, but at that time people think you're crazy to cycle. But with that vision, they slowly, by expanding public space, making it more efficient for people to go on public transport and integration. So after some, what he said is after 20, 30 years, slowly doing one thing at a time, we can change. But really, you cannot, you need to tune the message, basically. If you don't tune the message, then you basically, like what Christine just said, turn people off rather than helping the cause. But I still think that that is a very good lesson to look at least the European experience of how they actually achieve the change. And certainly planning, transport, as well as the environment has to be getting involved.
Thank you, Alexis. I saw Dr. Jinning's hands there.
Which is thanks very much to Christine just mentioned about the interesting work we have done so far. Thank you. So I think it's really appreciate Christine actually for every single air conference I see your face in your speech. But at the same time, I agree very much with you in terms of the air pollution. We always think about the environment, especially Hong Kong. And oftentimes, I think it's just more than environment. You mentioned about transport department, even the urban planning. And Christine just mentioned an interesting study right here in the center, in the heart of Hong Kong, the CBD. And we've seen many interesting linkage between transport and air pollution, and even public health, and especially even urban planning. So I think there were major effort that's not just air pollution, it's not just the environment. If we done through the transport, even the rerouting of the buses, for example, what we see here in the Davao is actually the major fleets of the buses, even the diesels, that contribute the most, and also the street canyon effects that can cause a lot of problems. So air pollution is just not just the environment, I guess. And as Kristen just mentioned, we need to engage more people from the government, transport, public health, and even urban planning. So again, pretty soon in the next few months, we will put effort in a more public engagement to put forward our central, to revitalize, to renew the central streets to try to improve air pollution. So pretty soon we can have more information to come up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can
Christine.
I just add something here? This is like a prelude. In the not too distant future, there's a new project which some people who've been working on it for a long time will launch. I believe it is exactly the kind of project that integrates some of the things that many of you have talked about and your institutions. That would be the time for you all to jump out and say, that's what we want. And that is only possible by several bureaus and departments working together. So when that comes, you will know, because it's a big deal. And it includes Jining's very, very fine work on air quality and vehicles. But as I said, we need you to go after some of the other departments to really say to the people at the top of the government, that's good for business, that's good for the economy, that's good for livability, that's good for the environment. Not just go on about air pollution, because that will fail.
Now we talk about engagement, and one of the best partners that we've been engaging has been the ship owners and the shipping lines. After I saw your hand, do you want to say something?
Well, actually, I was going to ask a couple of questions, not totally related to shipping. I hope that's okay. First of all, just to say that the policy address is not the be-all and end-all. I think we all know that it's not just a policy address. There's papers attached to the policy address which are not made public. There's a paper going to the Transport Parliament panel in LegCo today which does talk about cycling. So there are papers behind the policy address from different departments, and it's worthwhile everybody looking at those. And the reason I know the paper today was that I was looking, actually for the paper on the local vessel fuel testing. This is my first question. It's my understanding that the paper going into LegCo is for the supply of fuel. It's to mandate the supply of fuel, not to mandate the use of the fuel. That's my first question. And the reason I believe for that is because of local vessels, we have local vessels coming down from China, and it would be difficult to mandate the use of the fuel on those ships. But that's just a very technical question. Second question, and I also live in Discovery. When are we going to get around to compressed air fireworks? I mean, the New Year's celebration here in Hong Kong, the air pollution from that was incredible. We see every night, I mean, when we bought the apartment, we thought we'd love it, but every night we get the Disneyland fireworks. The air pollution from that as well. And we know that Disneyland in California is using compressed air fireworks. When can we get around to that in Hong Kong? Because the air pollution is quite large from that one effect. Thank you.
Well, I'll give Disneyland a call today and ask them when they're going to. I'll clarify exactly what they're using right now, and secondly is whether there are any plans for any kind of upgrade. Right? I'll do that. Peter, write it down. Right? We'll call Disneyland this afternoon. Secondly, no, the legislation for the use of cleaner fuels for local crafts will come out today. Will be gazetted today. Yes, there's a supply of the fuel, but ships are going to be required to use the clean fuels. So there are two papers. Well, just to clarify, when you're using when you're thinking about the policy address, what the chief executive, any chief executive, he can only say so much in about 2 hours, but everybody reads that. There's actually now, we've revived the practice of the complementary booklet. This is a much, much longer document. And it's very useful to look at that because it talks about all the new initiatives, more than what the chief executive can say, and all existing initiatives. So that's a very good kind of list. There are other documents that immediately after the policy address, they're then tabled to LegCo. So if you go on the LegCo site, you can go under transport, environment, and you can go under any of the departments. We all have to table explanatory documents to the legislature. And then in the coming week, even this afternoon, ministers will stand up and give press conferences to answer press questions. And then next week, there's a whole series of Q&A period for each of the ministers on all the subjects.
Thank you, Christine. Yes, Derek.
I'm Derek Wong from the U.S. Consulate here in Hong Kong. We've talked a lot about bridging the gap between science and policy, especially here in Hong Kong, and I wanted to pose this question to you, Professor Zhu. Looking a little bit at what's happening in Beijing, what do you see as you and your academic colleagues' role in the policy dialogue, not just in setting the targets, but also in figuring out how to best achieve improvements in air quality?
Okay, so comments regarding the working between the scientists and the policymakers has been made in different occasions. I think, in a sense, we have close links with policymakers that can help them to make their policy, in the sense that when they need us to do the same like this. But I think now the way Chinese government doing is they have kind of so many emergencies. So each time they have emergencies, they call a meeting, asking us as experts to provide recommendation suggestions. But the lack of systematic analysis and experts with sometimes under pressure to provide a recommendation, even though we don't have enough data to do the analysis. So it's a big concern for myself to make any recommendation without comprehensive analysis of the facts before we do make a recommendation. But that's actually happening now. Many policies now are making, I think we need to learn from US and other countries that we need this systematic, institutionalized way and the procedures to make sure that the experts provide the best knowledge available to the policymaker. And also this evidence needs to be peer reviewed, scrutinized, make sure there's not much things we are questioning. But it's not, we understand 100% before we take action, but it's the best knowledge we know at that time to make a recommendation. And also to be open, not just limit to a number of experts that's they know just because they know the government officers, but to be open to the scientific community in a larger sense, not limited the number of elite scientists. So I think there's a number of ways we can improve the communication with the policymakers, and I think the most important one is now time for China to have this systematic or mechanism. Like we have showed as a flow chart. It's not complicated, but I think it's the way to ensure the involvement of a large community of scientists contribute to the best knowledge to the policy making.
Thank you. John, since Professor Zhu mentioned USA and the system, can you share with us a little bit about how you as a scientist can influence policy or contribute to policy deliberation?
Yeah, well, my experience has been on many different levels, down to the cement plant whose neighbors are complaining about deposition in their yards, up to regional scale studies that have looked at the formation of secondary pollutants. And what generally we find is that there's a lot of argument about things that are knowable. So someone will say, well, SO2 is a nonlinear process, that just reducing SO2 is not going to reduce sulfate. So if you put an experiment in place, you can test that. And sure enough, the experiments show that as SO2 goes down, sulfate goes down. And so whereas that was an argument that was brought forth in the early 1980s, now it's done, it's over with. So I think there's three categories. There's things that are known, but the people making the decision don't know about. And that can be discovered. There are things you'll never know anything about. And those are things where if we're going to make a mistake, we should probably make it conservatively and err on the side of precaution. And then there's this middle ground, which is quite large, where we don't have to argue about it. We can define an experiment. If we can define the disagreement, we can define an experiment to test that and really convince the people that have to do something that has to be done. And I think over the years, we've seen that is a process that works out very well. And once the results are in, people will accept them, and they'll pay the price they have to implement the pollution control.
Thank you, John. Any more questions from the floor? No? Okay, now I would like to pose some questions to the panel, because this dialogue actually is also about looking forward, the next 5 to 10 years in this region, in Hong Kong in particular, but of course Christine and many other speakers talk about our role in China's effort to try and clean up. Can each of you share with us your insight about what's the most important thing in the next 5 years for either Hong Kong or this region to do or to pursue? I know it's big, and maybe you have a few things in mind, but can you just share with us what's the most important thing in your mind that you want to see in the next couple of years? Maybe I would start with Professor Zhu.
Wow, this is a big question. Yeah, this is so many things in my mind. When we look at Hong Kong in China with one country, two systems, but I think it's a very important thing is Hong Kong actually has been playing a leading role in the sense of many environmental protection and in the sense of air pollution control. So I think Hong Kong, what is happening in Hong Kong could be a good lesson for the rest of China, especially the rest of PRD, to follow. And this is in essence if Hong Kong can summarize anything, and I could teach other regions to control their own air pollutions. And of course, there's just we talk about air pollution, but I think that like we mentioned about air pollution, just not the environment issues. There's any issues linked with that. So how a city like Hong Kong developed in the future, how does Hong Kong see itself as a role in the PRD and other big cities in China, I think could set a good example for the rest of China.
Thank you. Paul?
Sure. I gave this answer yesterday. I think it's true, and it's a little bit of a non-traditional answer from a science perspective. But I think there's nothing more important than transparency and regular reporting of data. We've seen the power of that in mainland China, and it's unprecedented when China started reporting real-time PM 2.5 levels around the country, and you could log on. It's better than the U.S. You can log on and see real-time numbers in any city. There are many cities, and it's getting more and more pervasive, and that's going to keep this issue front and center. Everyone knows somebody with asthma. Everyone knows somebody with respiratory disease or another problem related to air pollution, and that's going to keep this issue on the front burner. Secondly, something that Barbara Finnemore brought up yesterday in the workshop, which we haven't talked about today, is the whole notion of demand reduction. And Christine alluded to end-of-pipe control, but really pushing the demand reduction upstream. I think you mentioned that 80% of Hong Kong's power was going to supply buildings, existing buildings, and whether there's a way to begin to attack that problem, to reduce demand, get away from the need for continued energy growth. And there was this target of 65% set for coal in terms of the energy mix, which was laudable, but the energy demand is growing so quickly that 65% means more and more in some cases, so it's not going to get us where we want to go. And the other thing I would say is just a unique opportunity for Hong Kong is given the level and the high quality of scientists and creative thinkers and technologists here, that the whole shipping question and the ability to export the gains that are made here to the entire Asian coast is really inspirational. It's a rare opportunity. And I expect there are other things like that where Hong Kong could be the real leader. So those are a few things.
Thank you, Paul. John?
I'd like to come back to the whole issue of accountability. We put a law in place, we put a pollution control in place, but unless we examine that and put also in place ways to inspect and enforce that, we're going to deceive ourselves into thinking something is being accomplished when nothing is being accomplished.
I actually think that asking for the most important thing is not right, because really it's too many things that has to happen together. I totally agree that transparency is on the top of it, because without it nothing will go. But sometimes people will get fatigued. Everyone knows it's bad, and after a year I don't know how many newspapers will continue to report that. We've seen that in climate change discussion, in many other things. So beyond transparency, I think capacity building. Prof. Zhu mentioned that they were overwhelmed by all the demand from all the provinces of, okay, come and tell us this is an urgent issue. The reason why that happened is the capacity to do this is not there in many provinces, in many cities. And to really address the issue, I think that capacity has to be there. Everyone wants to have good air quality. I don't believe there are people don't want that. But how to do it is not known in different level. So I think that capacity building is not mentioned too much in the rules. I think that is very important. And then also the institutionalization of this thing we talk about. So we need to do many more than just one.
Yes, I also find it hard to say there's one single thing, and actually if I just said one thing, everybody's going to complain that the government is incapable of doing more than one thing. So if I can describe maybe three things and why those three things are important. I think the first thing is, again, we're mandated by law to come up with a process to review the AQO. So that is a priority. We've got to get that done in the next couple of years, because after 2 years, we're into the review process. The second area is capacity building. I mean, of course, let's talk about the capacity in Hong Kong itself. This is something that the government cannot do all by themselves, because it's not just about building the capacity within government, but to have a community of people, experts and others who can enhance and expand the discussion that we have, people who can monitor, people who can measure, people who can argue with government and with each other about what's the best thing to do. Government is coming up with a bit more money to commission studies. So for example, for the first time, we're now commissioning more studies relating to air quality and health. However, I think the foundations and granting organizations in Hong Kong, if they want air quality to be something where Hong Kong can play a significant role, and I think you've heard from the experts, Hong Kong is actually in a good spot because we do have the expertise here. But the expertise is rather small, and the expertise in the whole of China is relatively small. So investments from funding organizations, not non-government funding organizations, to commission the right kind of research to help build capacity within the universities, within the NGO community, within related disciplines, would be very, very important. Now, the third thing is really about collaboration. Obviously, locally, you want to see more collaboration within government, right? More obvious collaboration. I'm not saying there's none, but what I'm saying is we do need to strengthen and enhance that. The question I have for you is how can you also be more creative to include or to reframe subjects in a way where more departments, or maybe there could be, can you imagine another minister leading a discussion where air pollution is one of the subjects? Right? So that kind of reframing, re-massaging of the subjects in many different ways. Secondly is regionally, we are doing joint studies with Guangdong. We've just agreed on doing a new study with Guangdong, which will last a couple of years, on PM 2.5, a very, very important study. Secondly is, don't forget, we also have to work with industry. Industry, we have a lot of investments across the border in Guangdong. And we do have a very interesting and so far very successful but very small project called the Cleaner Production Partnership Project, where Hong Kong, the government, provides stimulation funding for demonstration projects in Guangdong for emissions reduction. We've looked at energy efficiency, we've looked at water, but we've also put a great emphasis today on pollution reduction, particularly VOC, which is a very difficult issue regionally for us to do. I know many of you don't talk about that because that's not in your framework about what's important. So ask the question of what Hong Kong can do across the border. where we don't have regulatory jurisdiction. It is a small project, but it's a project very popular in Guangdong. So we're trying to think about how to expand that project. That project, the funding will end in 2015. So one of the things that I'm very committed to do is to use 2014 to talk with the stakeholders. This is again one of those projects where we talk to the industry sector here, the manufacturing sector in Hong Kong. It's a project that is also very popular with them. So how can we work out an even bigger scheme, perhaps, an even more interesting scheme to launch after the current scheme comes to an end? Something I'm personally very committed to do. But nobody ever asked me about this project. I'm the only person I feel going around telling it to everybody, right? So help us on that. Shipping, again, as I said, our vision for a regional collaboration on fuel switching at berth, but eventually leading to an ECA, an emissions control area. This is a very, very big vision. So this is something where we have to work very closely with the stakeholders in the industry. So these are the things, these are my priorities. These are the things that we're going to have to do at the same time.
Thank you, Christine. And I would also like to thank my panel, Professor Zhu Tong, Mr. Robert O'Keefe, Dr. John Watson, and Professor Alexis Lau. Now please give them a round of applause. Now I do hope that after this dialogue, this event, you will feel a bit more assured that these top scientists and policymakers and friends from the industries are working very hard behind the scene to try to improve our air quality. But when you leave the building, when you hit the road, you'll be back in reality. So remember what Christine's asked you to memorize, the 5 things that Hong Kong should do, and try to tell your friends that you also have a responsibility. We all have to do it together. This is a long journey, but this is a very important journey that we have to make. Thank you very much for coming. I hope to see you soon, and Happy New Year.